A basic consideration of ethics in social research has to do with assuring that no harm is visited upon the participants who provide the information for the study, nor upon the researchers who undertake it. It makes sense that the participants in research must be shielded from various forms of harm or risks while participating in a study. However, it was not too long ago that there were horrific experiments carried out in the name of science. These include the Nazi medical experiments where doctors conducted murderous and torturous human experiments in the concentration camps, the Tuskegee syphilis study, the thalidomide tragedy, and many others. Let me give a brief summary of 3 of these examples of horrific human subject experimentation and the resulting lessons on ethics. The Tuskegee syphilis study was conducted between 1932 and 1972 by the U.S. Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control. The study aimed to observe the effects of syphilis when left untreated. 600 African American sharecroppers from rural Alabama were enlisted as the participants, persuaded by the promise of free medical exams, free meals, and burial insurance. Of the 600, 399 had syphilis, and 201 did not. The researchers did not inform these individual participants about their diagnosis, whether they had syphilis or not, nor were they told about the nature of the experiment. When funding for the treatment dried up, the researchers continued the study, administering placebos and other ineffective therapies under the guise of treating patients' bad blood, a local term that describes several ailments, including fatigue, anemia, and syphilis. By the time the Tuskegee syphilis study ended, 28 participants had died from syphilis, and 100 more from related complications. Moreover, 40 spouses of the participants had been infected, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. The scandal led to the establishment of the Office of Human Research Protections and the passage of federal laws and regulations requiring institutional review boards for studies involving human participants. Nonetheless, it had succeeded in sowing distrust among African Americans in both the medical establishment and the U.S. federal government. The thalidomide birth defect crisis. Originally developed as a sedative and mood stabilizer and treatment for nausea, thalidomide was first approved for over-the-counter sale in West Germany in 1953. The drug would later be sold in over 40 countries and was marketed to expecting mothers as a cure for morning sickness. Physicians began questioning its safety after noticing an increase in babies born with abnormalities to mothers who had taken the drug. Among these abnormalities were the shortening and absence of limbs, malformation of hands and fingers, sensory impairment, facial disfigurement, and damage to the brain, internal organs, and skeletal structures. Thalidomide was advertised as safe for pregnant women. There was zero clinical evidence to support the claim of safety, as this was extrapolated from toxicity tests conducted on mice who showed no adverse effects on consuming large doses of the drug. It is estimated that between 10 and 20,000 people were affected by the use of thalidomide during pregnancy. Approximately 40% of the thalidomide babies died shortly after birth, while those that survived suffered from severe physical deformities. The crisis led to the passage of regulations like the Kefauver-Harris Amendment in the U.S., which requires drug makers to prove the safety and efficacy of their products and obtain the informed consent of participants in human clinical drug trials. In turn, the UK mandated that medicines could no longer be approved based solely on results from animal testing. The Nazi medical experiments. At the height of the Second World War, Nazi scientists and physicians carried out gruesome medical experiments on prisoners of concentration camps to study the effects of harsh combat conditions and hazards soldiers would face in battle, devise new treatments to support the recovery of injured servicemen, and develop chemical weapons that could be added to Germany's military arsenal. Ethnic, religious, and sexual minorities, POWs, and disabled Germans were forcibly recruited to participate in these studies, which were typically carried out without administering anesthesia and often resulted in the psychological trauma, mutilation, and death of its subjects. The horror and opprobrium that these experiments roused led to the drafting of the Nuremberg Code, which laid out ethical research principles for human experimentation. Though the code itself has little relevance to everyday medical practice today, it is nonetheless noteworthy for spurring the creation and ratification of ethical charters for biomedical and behavioral studies. These days, the modern 21st century conception of the social researcher is far from the mad scientist stereotype conducting evil scientific experiments. Nonetheless, to avoid lapses of ethical judgment by well-meaning researchers, it is necessary to continually remind social scientists about research ethics, about the principles of non-malfeasance, or the obligation not to inflict harm on others, and respect for human dignity. Now, what is harm? Harm may be physical or psychological. Examples of physical harm are injury and discomfort, while psychological harm or trauma results from emotional distress or anxiety, embarrassment, intimidation, coercions, and threats and other similar manifestations. Harm may also be legal, social, and economic. Legal and social harms cover a swath of potential risks, from the collection and digital storage of participant data, infringement of intellectual property rights, loss of privacy, breach of confidentiality, while economic harms involve monetary costs borne by the participant for travel, food, etc., as well as loss of time and income. Here are some key concepts related to social research ethics. Researchers are bound by the rules of ethics that provide for protecting their study participants from the types of harm that we just identified. To reiterate, 1. Research participants must be protected from physical or psychological harm, including loss of dignity, loss of autonomy, and loss of self-esteem. Secondly, their privacy must be safeguarded. Third, research participants must be shielded against deception, particularly unjustified deception. Fourthly, they must voluntarily give their consent to participate in the research study. In the case of studies involving participants below the age of 18, consent must be granted by both the minors and their guardians. Let us define these key concepts: voluntary participation and informed consent, confidentiality and anonymity, and how they implicate on the research process and results. Voluntary participation means that research participants are not coerced to become a respondent or a human test subject in a scientific study. When invited to participate, they have the right to refuse, and when they have given their consent to participate, they have the right to opt out. In other words, research participants are free to withhold or revoke their participation at any point. If they wish, they may refuse to follow procedures and/or answer questions that make them uncomfortable or cross their personal boundaries. Besides the fact that the right of refusal is sacrosanct and individual autonomy must always be respected, people who feel pressured or coerced into participation may provide insincere or inaccurate responses that further undermine the validity and integrity of the research. However, this right of refusal can also compromise study results. For one, the generalizability or external validity of the study conclusions is hampered, as refusals constitute a component of non-response bias. Additionally, more resources, time and money, are needed to replace those who refuse or drop off from participating in the research study. Hence, it is necessary for the researcher to build in mechanisms to minimize refusals by earning the trust and confidence of research participants. How can this be done? Informed consent. Informed consent provides prospective participants with adequate time to consider a research invitation. This also assures them that their personal data and any private information that may be shared over the course of the research will be protected under confidentiality. Informed consent means informed decision-making. That is, potential research participants are provided with all appropriate information about the study to make an informed decision about participating in it. This means that consent is given by the participant prospectively, that is, before she or he becomes a study respondent. Importantly, the prospective participant understands what the study is about and what is expected of her or him. Additionally, no undue influence is exerted on the participant to consent. Confidentiality is an assurance of privacy to research participants that their identities will not be revealed. Possible violations of confidentiality may happen when researchers employ observation as a data gathering method. Observations, whether covert or overt, via audio recording, photography, or audiovisual filming, should be done with great care and only when necessary to achieve research objectives. The ethical social researcher should obtain explicit consent from participants to be photographed and recorded and explain why, how, and where these recordings will be used. Even in situations when the video recording and photography will not show the participant's face, researchers should take pains to disguise his physical features, remove background noise, and all clues that could be used to identify the participant. Anonymity, meanwhile, means that even the researcher cannot identify the research subjects. Between quantitative and qualitative research studies, it is the former that may have more assurance of anonymity. Quantitative data gathering utilizes self-administered questionnaires, which collect information on respondent characteristics, such as biological sex, ethnicity, age, or socioeconomic status, rather than name or birth date. After data collection has ended, the researcher is unable to trace one particular survey respondent to the one unique individual who completed it. Under conditions of confidentiality, the researcher knows the identities of her or his research participants, but promises not to reveal them, while under conditions of anonymity, even the researcher is blind to their identities. In both cases of confidentiality and anonymity, it is the researcher's responsibility to protect the research participants by disguising the identities, by using pseudonyms, blurring appearances, not disclosing information, location, features, behaviors, and social categories that could identify the participants. This protection extends to encrypting and securing their data and records. In summary, the conduct of social scientific research, particularly when human participants are involved, demands beneficence, doing good, avoiding malfeasance or harm, respect for human dignity, privacy, freedom, and autonomy. Throughout the research study, the ethical social scientist should see to it that the procedures she or he employs does not in any way jeopardize the integrity of knowledge, collegiality, honesty, objectivity, and openness, which are the principles of responsible science. In another lecture, I will discuss the instances of ethics during the research planning, gathering, analyzing, and reporting phases, and when the social science researcher will need to be especially sensitive to protecting herself, himself, and his research participants from harm. Thank you for your attention.